I always thought trust was something solid, like a bridge you build over time, plank by plank. And for years, I believed our bridge was unshakable. But bridges don't collapse in one swift moment. They crack slowly, with signs you refuse to see until it's too late. It started when my wife, Claire, began talking about something new, something I didn't know how to handle. "I've been thinking about a boudoir photo shoot," she said one evening, sitting across from me at the dinner table. Her eyes lit up like it was the best idea she'd ever had. I blinked, trying to process it. "You mean like lingerie pictures?" She nodded eagerly. "But tasteful. Soft lighting, neutral tones. It's more about confidence than anything else." I hesitated. I knew Claire had always struggled with self-esteem, and if this was something that would make her feel empowered, who was I to stand in the way? But at the same time, it felt too personal, too exposed. "I don't know," I muttered. "Isn't that a bit much?" Her face fell, just slightly. "It's not like I'm posting it everywhere. It's for me, to remind myself that I'm beautiful." We left it there, but the conversation wasn't really over. Every few days, she'd bring it up again, always with that same hopeful look. I'd dodge, deflect, and change the subject. But I knew she wasn't going to let it go. One night, after another half-hearted argument, I realized something. Claire wasn't asking for permission. She was asking for my support. And as much as it made me uncomfortable, I couldn't be the reason she felt small. So, I gave in. "Fine, Eastside. Do it. Just be careful, all right?" She practically jumped out of her chair to hug me. "Thank you. You'll see. It's nothing like what you're imagining." I didn't know how wrong she'd be. The photo shoot came and went. Claire returned home that evening, glowing in a way I hadn't seen in a long time. She was practically buzzing with excitement, like she'd rediscovered a part of herself that had been buried for years. "It was amazing," she gushed. "The photographer was so professional. I felt powerful." I tried to smile, but something gnawed at me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd opened a door I wasn't ready to walk through. A week later, she showed me one of the photos, a tasteful black and white shot with soft shadows and a dreamy, ethereal vibe. Claire looked stunning, but all I could think was, who else is going to see this? "It's just for us," she reassured me. I nodded, forcing myself to swallow the rising discomfort. All right. Days passed, and life went on as usual, until it didn't. One lazy Saturday, I was scrolling through my feed when I saw something that made my stomach drop. There, on her makeup artist page, was Claire's photo. Not just any photo. The photo she'd shown me, the one she promised was just for us. The caption read, "A perfect look for a perfect shoot. Confidence is the best makeup you can wear." I stared at it, hoping I was wrong, hoping it wasn't really her. But it was. I knew that silhouette, that look in her eyes. I could barely breathe. When Claire got home that evening, I showed her the post, barely holding back my frustration. "Why is this online?" She frowned, looking genuinely confused. "It's just on her page to show off her work. No one even knows it's me." "I know it's you," I said quietly. "And you promised." She sighed, brushing past me like I was making a big deal out of nothing. "It's not that serious. Honestly, no one's paying attention." I wanted to believe her, but something inside me had already shifted. It wasn't just about the photo anymore. It was about the fact that she didn't see how much it mattered to me, that she didn't care. After that, things started to change. I'd noticed Claire spending more time at the studio, getting her hair and makeup done before nights out with friends. She'd smile at me, oblivious to the quiet unease growing between us. One evening, she was late, really late. I sat at the dinner table alone, watching the clock. The silence was deafening. I poured myself a glass of whiskey, trying to calm down. I told myself not to spiral. But with every passing minute, my mind filled with questions I didn't want to ask. When she finally walked through the door, she looked radiant, like she'd stepped out of a magazine shoot. Her hair was flawless, her makeup perfect. She was glowing, and I hated it. "You're late," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. She shrugged, unfazed. "We lost track of time. No big deal. No big deal." That phrase replayed in my mind as she walked past me like I was invisible. That night, I stared at the ceiling for hours, listening to the sound of her breathing beside me. She fell asleep instantly, peaceful and unaware of the storm building inside me. But I was wide awake, wondering when exactly our story had started to unravel. The days after that night felt off, like I was standing on the edge of something, waiting for it to give way beneath me. Claire carried on like nothing had changed, smiling, laughing, texting her friends. But to me, everything felt different. The worst part? I didn't know how to bring it up without sounding paranoid. Every time I tried, the words caught in my throat. What was I supposed to say? I don't like the way you've been acting lately. I feel like I'm losing you. Instead, I bottled it up. But the pressure kept building. Claire's nights out became more frequent. She'd make some excuse, dinner with friends, a self-care day at the studio, and come home hours later, looking like she'd walked out of some glamorous event. She always smelled like expensive perfume and something else, a strange kind of distance I couldn't place. I wanted to ask her what was really going on, but deep down, I already knew. I was afraid of the answer. The night everything changed started like any other. Claire had another evening planned with her friends. She was getting ready in front of the mirror, curling her hair, humming along to some song I didn't recognize. I watched her from the doorway, trying to remember the last time we'd spent an evening together. Just the two of us. Do you really have to go? I asked, my voice quieter than I meant. She paused for a second, like she was considering it. Then she gave me a small, apologetic smile. It's just one night. We'll have the whole weekend. I wanted to tell her that it wasn't just about tonight, that I felt like she was slipping further away with every outing, every missed conversation. But all I said was, okay. She kissed me on the cheek and left, her heels clicking against the floor as the door closed behind her. I sat there in silence, staring at my reflection in the dark TV screen. And for the first time in my life, I felt like a ghost in my own home. An hour passed. Then two. My mind started racing again, filling with every worst-case scenario it could conjure. Who was she really with? What was she doing? I grabbed my keys before I could second-guess myself and headed out. I wasn't even sure where I was going until I pulled up outside the makeup studio, the place she always went to before meeting her friends. The lights inside were still on. I could see shadows moving through the window. I told myself I was overreacting, that she was probably just getting her hair touched up like always. But something in my gut wouldn't let me turn the car around. I got out and walked toward the door. What I saw inside stopped me cold. Claire was lying on a cushioned bench in the middle of the studio. Two men, guys I'd never seen before, stood on either side of her, their hands working across her shoulders and arms in what looked like some kind of massage. They were laughing, too familiar, too casual. One of them leaned down and whispered something that made her smile. And there I was, standing at the door with a bouquet of flowers I'd picked up on the way. I don't know how long I stood there, frozen in place, my heart thudding in my chest. Finally, the makeup artist spotted me and gasped. The room fell silent. The men turned to look at me, their faces somewhere between smug and awkward. Claire sat up, her eyes wide with shock. "Wait," she said, her voice shaking. "This isn't what it looks like." I dropped the flowers. For a second, I almost believed her. Almost. But the scene in front of me said otherwise. Without a word, I turned and walked back to my car. I heard her calling my name, heard her footsteps behind me. But I didn't stop. By the time I reached my car and slammed the door shut, everything felt like it had cracked wide open. Whatever was left of our bridge had fallen apart. I drove away without looking back. That night, I didn't go home. I crashed at my best friend's place, still in shock. He didn't ask many questions, just handed me a beer and let me sit in silence. I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that image again. Claire, surrounded by strangers, smiling like I didn't exist. I kept replaying everything in my head, trying to make sense of it. By morning, I made up my mind. I wasn't going back, not yet anyway. I needed space. Time to figure out what the hell I was supposed to do next. I spent the next few days in a fog, going through the motions like a robot. My friend tried to pull me out of it with small talk, distractions, and jokes, but I barely responded. Everything felt muted, like the world was happening around me, but I wasn't really part of it. Claire called me, texted me, over and over. At first, I ignored it all, but eventually, I opened one of her messages. "Please, just talk to me." It wasn't long, just those words, but I stared at them for what felt like hours. My thumb hovered over the screen, torn between deleting the message and replying. I didn't know what I wanted. Answers? An apology? For her to admit that everything between us had become a lie? I wasn't sure I'd even believe her anymore. Still, the ache of missing her was stronger than I expected. No matter how angry I was, she was still the woman I had shared a life with. And as much as I hated it, I still loved her. On the fourth day, I gave in. I called her back. Her voice cracked when she answered, like she'd been crying. Thank God. I thought you'd never call. I stayed quiet, letting her speak first. She filled the silence with rushed explanations, telling me that the whole scene was just a misunderstanding. The guys at the studio were part of a wellness partnership the makeup artist had started, something about relaxation treatments. Nothing inappropriate, she swore. I wasn't trying to hide anything from you, she said. I didn't think it was a big deal. That line again, the same one she used when the photos went public. It's not a big deal. It was like she didn't realize how every small thing had stacked up, brick by brick, into this wall between us. But I didn't argue. I was too tired for another fight. Instead, I agreed to meet her at home for dinner. If nothing else, I wanted to see for myself if there was anything left to salvage. When I walked through the door, the house smelled like basil and cheese. She'd made homemade pizza, her attempt to recreate our first dinner date. She looked hopeful but nervous, like she was trying to make things right, but wasn't sure how. We sat at the table, eating in near silence. I could barely taste the food. I kept waiting for her to say something meaningful, to acknowledge what had happened in a way that felt real. But instead, we made small talk, surface level, polite, empty. She asked how I was holding up, as if we were acquaintances catching up after some long trip. It wasn't until we'd finished eating that she finally asked, "Do you even want to fix this?" The question caught me off guard. I thought about it, really thought about it. I'd been asking myself that same question every day since I left. But the answer wasn't simple. Part of me wanted to believe we could go back to the way things were, to the comfort and security of our old life. But another part of me knew we couldn't. Too much had happened. I don't know, I admitted. I don't know if I trust you anymore. She flinched, like the words had physically hit her. I didn't cheat on you. Her voice was steady, but her eyes shimmered with unshed tears. I know it looks bad. I know I screwed up, but I didn't cross that line. I wanted to believe her so badly that it hurt. But trust isn't something you can will back into existence. It doesn't work like that. I nodded, more to end the conversation than to agree with her. After dinner, I stayed for a little while longer. We sat on the couch, side by side but miles apart. When it got late, she asked if I'd stay the night. I hesitated, but I could see how much she wanted me to. I said yes. We didn't really talk after that. We just lay there, silent and tangled in the kind of quiet that felt more like surrender than comfort. In the middle of the night, I woke up and stared at the ceiling, the weight of everything pressing down on me. This wasn't reconciliation. It was a bandage over a gaping wound. The next morning, I left without saying much. She asked if I'd come back for dinner again, and I nodded out of habit. I didn't know if I was making things better or dragging us both through something we'd never recover from. The next few weeks followed the same strange pattern. I'd go over for dinner, we'd talk, sometimes even laugh. On the surface, we looked like a couple trying to rebuild. But underneath, I felt disconnected, like I was watching someone else live my life. Some nights, I stayed. Some nights, I didn't. She never asked me to move back in permanently, and I never offered. Our conversations became longer, but less meaningful. We avoided the hard topics. Whenever the tension built, we'd distract ourselves with wine, old movies, or reruns of sitcoms we used to love. But the more we avoided the truth, the more I could feel the weight of everything between us growing heavier. One night, after another routine dinner, Claire leaned against the doorway as I grabbed my jacket. "I'm scared," she whispered. I turned to face her, waiting for her to continue. "I'm scared that you're only here because you don't know how to let me go." Her words hit harder than I expected because they were true. I'd been holding on, not because I thought we'd fix things, but because I didn't know how to walk away from the life we built. I wanted to tell her she was wrong. I wanted to promise her that things would get better, but the truth was I couldn't. We were stuck in a place between love and loss, and neither of us knew how to move forward. The next morning, I packed the rest of my things. Claire didn't cry, and neither did I. We just stood there, staring at the finality of it. "I'm sorry," I said softly. She nodded, her eyes full of understanding and heartbreak. When I walked out that door for the last time, I felt something I hadn't expected. It wasn't relief or sadness. It was emptiness. People always say that moving on feels like freedom, but it didn't. It felt like walking away from everything familiar into something terrifyingly unknown. The first few weeks after I left for good were the hardest. I kept telling myself that this was the right thing, that I deserved peace, but there was no peace, just silence. I woke up every morning expecting to hear her footsteps in the hallway, the sound of her humming while she made coffee. But there was nothing, just the hum of the fridge and the occasional bird outside the window. I stayed with my friend for a while longer, trying to adjust to the reality of being on my own again. He was supportive in the way good friends are, by giving me space when I needed it and distraction when I didn't. But there was only so much he could do. The rest of it was up to me. I tried to stay busy. I picked up extra shifts at work, went to the gym more often, and even started saying yes to invitations I would have ignored before. But no matter what I did, there was always this nagging feeling like I'd left something unfinished, like I'd walked away from a fire that still hadn't burned out. Then one night, Claire called me. I stared at the screen, debating whether to pick up. Part of me wanted to hear her voice, to know if she was okay. The other part knew that hearing her would only drag me back into the emotional quicksand I was finally starting to climb out of. I let it go to voicemail. Her message was short. I hope you're doing okay. I just wanted you to know I'm thinking of you. I listened to it 3 times before I deleted it. It wasn't an apology, not exactly, but it felt like she was trying to keep the door open, even if only a crack. And I couldn't afford to let it stay open anymore. A few days later, I met up with an old coworker for drinks. We'd never been particularly close, but she'd reached out after hearing about the split. She'd been through a divorce a year earlier and knew what that kind of loneliness felt like. The night was normal. We talked about work, movies, random things that didn't carry any emotional weight. And for the first time in weeks, I laughed without forcing it. I went home that night and realized something. Claire had been my whole world for so long that I'd forgotten who I was outside of us. I wasn't just grieving the relationship. I was grieving the person I'd been when we were together. And that person was gone. I didn't reach out to Claire after that. Slowly, the calls and texts stopped coming. We became what I think we were always destined to be after everything that happened. Memories. A series of moments that felt like they belonged to someone else's life. A month after our last conversation, the papers came through. Final. No more limbo. No more pretending we could hold it together. I signed my name at the bottom and felt that same emptiness all over again. But this time, I didn't fight it. I let it sit there, knowing that the only way out was through. The next time I ran into Claire, it was completely by accident. I was at the grocery store, standing in line, when I heard her laugh from 2 registers over. It felt like a punch to the gut. I turned instinctively, and there she was, smiling, radiant, and talking to someone I didn't recognize. She didn't see me, and I didn't go out of my way to make myself known. I just watched her for a few seconds longer than I should have, and then turned back around. The strangest thing was that there wasn't any anger left, just a bittersweet acceptance that we had both moved on in our own ways. As I walked to my car, I let out a long breath. The kind of breath you don't realize you've been holding for months. Claire and I weren't enemies. We weren't even really broken. We were just 2 people who tried to hold on to something that was already gone. And that's the thing about trust. Once it breaks, you can glue it back together all you want, but the cracks will always show. I got in my car, turned on the radio, and drove home. I didn't look back. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't need to.